All right. Well, welcome back into Wisdom for the Church. I am glad to be here and glad for you to join me now or watch this later. So, just happy to be streaming again on a Thursday night. Going to try a different time. This time around 8:15 Eastern. This time usually I'm at 9:15, but just want to try something different. See if it is a little bit easier on me in terms of the later times. With this stream, basically the goal is to take a look, an examination, to sort of look at second wave feminism. And let me pull up my notes on my phone real quick. But yeah, second wave feminism. And in a previous stream last week, I basically looked at first wave feminism. So late 1800s and into the early 1900s, ending in about 1920. And I was planning to do just an entire, look at modern feminism in the West from first through current wave. But then honestly, I realized that, there's so much here that I can only really do one at a time, which is why I did first wave. And it was a lot of content, to be honest. So just to pull up one thing that I looked at and did a later video on, this is one of the OGs of feminism, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, right? And she wrote the Woman's Bible, basically her commentary on the very few selected important passages of the Old and New Testament, and basically what she believes how it should be, written and interpreted. So she rethinks the Trinity instead of Father, Son, Spirit. For example, she thought, Father, Son, and Heavenly Mother would be more appropriate. So, it just went to show that the foundations of even first wave feminism were in certain respects demonic and against God's order. And oftentimes first wave gets a pass for just being about rights or just being about the dignity of women. That's not the full story. Basically, there's a lot more going on than just that. And so that's what we did, last time as we looked at first wave feminism. And I was so, appetized by that in terms of, wow, there's a lot here that I thought, well, I'll do second wave and then I'll probably do the next time, third wave, just because there's so much here and it's impacted our culture and way of thinking in so many ways. So that's Cady Stanton, a real looker for sure. Couple important characters that we'll talk about. Here. Thank you so much, Charlie. Love you, brother, very much. The Hammer joins us here. A couple figures we'll talk about, but here's just their pictures. We've got Simone, I think it's pronounced Dubois. Wrote a very, very important work in the late 1940s, which we'll get into regarding women and society and liberation, things like that. And then Betty Friedman as well, who later wrote a work that was a bit more broad for the masses and more almost like pop women's lib. Like it reached more people, maybe was ideas that were already prevalent in academic circles, but she brought feminism, I feel like, to a whole new generation in a fresh way. Right. So she helped usher in that second wave very much is what I'm getting at. And so, yeah, I did want to, lay out some of my thoughts before we get into actually looking at second wave-ism completely. And so here is some of that. Here's what I want to get into. So I wanted to start with some what I call preliminaries, and you can see it on the sort of blue box up on the screen there. So these are more my thoughts on feminism in general before we get into second wave, to remind us of our foundation. So I believe that feminism is almost always one of two things is going on. Number one, feminism is, broadly speaking, a bad solution to sometimes a very real problem. Or it's a bad solution to a fake problem. What do I mean? A bad solution to a real problem or a bad solution to a fake problem. I know there are exceptions. I'm not saying it's completely bad in every last respect, but in general, I think this is what's going on. So, for example, a bad solution to a real problem in terms of feminism, I believe, would be when prohibition was passed at some point in the early 1920s, I believe, right? So prohibition. There was a real problem, from what I've gathered, with drunkenness in, early 20th century life, maybe domestic abuse based on drunkenness, unruliness, right? Things like that. And so it's a real problem that needs to be addressed. We can't just have people running around drunk all the time. We can't have domestic abuse happening, potentially because of alcohol, these things. But a bad solution, I believe, would just be to ban alcoholic beverages, right? Something that we even see, drinking in scripture, like wine cheers the heart. Jesus changes water into wine. I get that it's not a one-to-one because I'm sure alcoholic content was not exactly the same, but it's not explicitly a sin to drink alcohol. So, that's just like, wow, feminism, because the right to vote came in 1920, all of a sudden prohibition was passed seemingly almost immediately. But it didn't think of any other way to solve that problem, such as tighter laws on domestic abuse or maybe curfew laws or something else, right? We could think of something else without completely ruining it for everyone who did something responsibly, right? I think going to a jurisdiction and a sphere that the government just doesn't have, right? So a bad solution to where there's actually a real problem of drunkenness. A bad solution to a fake problem, though, like something that's not actually a problem, but we say it's a problem and then we solve it, but we actually do something that's wrong and make something worse. So a fake problem would be the oppression of male headship in the home. That is, the institution in and of itself is basically oppressive or slavery, something like that, right? So that would be a fake problem, because what we see in nature and what we also see laid out clearly in scripture is that male headship in the home is absolutely God's design from jump in Genesis. Adam, who had his helpmate, Eve, right? And not the other way around. It's repeated all throughout the scriptures, explicitly mentioned in the New Testament. And so seeing that as a problem is not a real problem, but a fake problem. Authority, of course, can be abused, right? A man can go past what his actual authority is or twist it to doing something that's actually making his wife sin or something, right? That's not a real use of authority. But male headship in general in marriage is absolutely a real concept, and to run away from that is to embrace sin, right? And so to deny that, like Katie Stanton did, if you read some of her comments on marriage and divorce and things, was a bad solution to a very fake problem, because the problem was not male headship in society. Perhaps the problem was not regulated male headship. Perhaps the problem was male headship without any thought behind what we were actually trying to head. But that was not the problem in and of itself, right? So that, I think, is going on often with feminism. Bad solutions to either real or fake problems, because the solution is rejecting male headship, essentially. Father rule, which is what patriarchy means. And that's a bad solution because that's God's way of the world. That's how he's designed things, particularly in family and particularly in religious matters, and mostly, I think, as well, civil matters in terms of keeping good order and enforcing good order in society. The government's a ministry of the sword. The sword is something that requires force and the skill to use when necessary. And I think generally that is going to be a masculine endeavor for the protection of both men and women. As I mentioned last week, another way to think about feminism, that's like one way to think about it. Another way to think about feminism more specifically is, what is it in terms of framing? How should we as Christians think in terms of our framing? Oh, thanks, brother. No problem. Yeah, love you, man. Have a good one, Charlie. Thanks for being on for a little bit. So feminism, how we should actually think of it, in my estimation, is number one, a denial of God by denying his good design for male headship, particularly in the home. If you go to the early sources from Jump, like Katie Stanton, her comments, she saw male headship as, in the home particularly, as something that women need to be liberated from. And so it's a denial of male headship in the home, and therefore it is a denial of God, right? Because I can't follow God and say, hey, let's follow God, and but then do whatever I want that contradicts what God says, right? And in that case, I'm trying to talk out of both sides of my mouth. I'm having to have my cake and eat it too. It does not work. So if I say I don't want what God says is the right way to do things, I want to do it this way, I can't then saying, hey, let's go follow God. It just doesn't work that way. What is up? Lo-Fi, aka T-Dog, aka Tyler. What's up, brother? Good to see you. Yeah, glad you're here. Glad you were here very much, my friend. Yeah, so that's number one. First and foremost, as a broad brush, Feminism, as a way of thinking, is a denial of God by denying male headship, particularly in the home. And as I said, I think last stream, that is going to have tentacles, ripples into society, right? Societies are built on households, and households have a certain order and a certain direction, a certain place that we should be going, honoring God in the ways that He has made us and what He calls good versus evil, right? But if we're denying that basic design, we're not following God. Number two, I think of feminism as an assault on womanhood and femininity. An assault on womanhood and femininity. I said it, I think I said it last stream. When I think of feminism in terms of femininity, feminism is like a reverse engineering of womanhood. It's a reverse engineering of our women, so that they are basically made to be an egalitarian, almost nothing, almost exactly like men, but it's like a Frankenstein type thing, because you know they're just not meant to be men. They're not men, right? And so when women are trying to always be in male spaces, and we're not acknowledging obvious sex differences, things are not going to go well. So it's an assault on womanhood and femininity. I think we see the fruits of it now more than ever. Something that's, I mentioned again last stream, something that's very near and dear to God's heart regarding women is a gentle and quiet spirit, and nothing could be further from what's promoted and practiced in our society today. And before anyone may accuse me or may think that I'm just going after, oh, I can't believe women, 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 I can't believe. No, we have plenty of problems with men too in our society. We're effeminate oftentimes, we're cowardly, we're passive, all things that are not generally masculine traits that God would honor, but ones that, He would call something to be ashamed of. Cowards will not inherit the kingdom of God. But again, we're talking about feminism, and when we're talking about feminism, usually we're talking about first and foremost women and what we're talking about with women. So that's why I'm talking about women, women, women. So it's a reverse engineering of women and femininity, and it makes them just into these loud, proud people that first and foremost see household and submission in household as shackles. And I don't like separating feminism from that because I think it's dishonest. Thank you for the bros outdoors for being here as well. So it's like a genie that has been let out of the bottle in terms of, when we get even first wave feminism, that we'll get into second wave tonight. It's something that once it's been let out, because it is so profoundly different than God's design and profoundly different than what even Western society had practiced previously, the consequences are going to have to run their course with feminism. And I think we've been reaping the benefits or non-benefits of that, consequence for now 80 years, something like that, or more than 80 years, actually, like over 100 years. One of the basic premises of the women's lib movement is that traditional views on womanhood are essentially oppressive. And when I think of traditional views on womanhood, I think of the solar system, kind of what you revolve around in life being the building up of your household within the direction and purview of your husband who you are following, helpmate language. And it's not meaningless work. It doesn't mean that your life doesn't touch outside the home, right? We talked about the Proverbs 31 woman. She considers a field and buys it. People in the area praise her, not just her family. So obviously her life touched the outside world. So it's not about a woman working or not working in the home. It's about solar system, and it's about what are you building toward and why are you making the decisions you make, right? That's a big difference between modern kind of way of thinking, feminism, and what I would call biblical womanhood. It's about solar system. It's about why we're making the decisions we're making. And so if it's true that it's profoundly different than what was even, 150, 200 years ago in the West, we cannot expect that the fruit of the movement will not have its consequences. And because it's rejecting God's order, that it won't be overarchingly good, it's going to be bad. Since we've let the genie out of the bottle, which is re-engineering womanhood, the consequences will run their course. And here are just a few. And this is not even acknowledging some of the most obvious things we see today, like sexual degeneracy of women, all these sorts of things. But here's one I thought of. If you see that, being a domestic housewife as your primary identity in society, and your primary, focus is rearing and raising children to be productive members of society, right? If you do see that as a sort of oppression, well, clearly there will have to be a different way of raising children than what was previously done, meaning it can't be the same as it was, because it was, in general, a man kind of spending a lot of his time laboring with his hands or laboring with his mind for the protection and also the financial stability of his family, while, in general, a woman would spend more time with the children in the day to day under the general direction of her husband. But if it's true that this is oppressive and we should be more career focused, or we should be more this focused or that focused, obviously raising children will be have to be different. It would have to be different. And I don't think we've thought through the consequences for a long time of that. Physical time with children, I would think, at least in the West, are at an all-time low the last 100 years with increasing frequency, right? Because if, which seems to be the case, that if life, sort of things moving and shaking in life, happen outside the home for the most part, then it's like, well, the home is just somewhere where we come and play Monopoly maybe on Friday nights and maybe watch a movie, a Disney movie or something. Um, but since feminism has occurred and women's liberation, whatever you want to call it, I feel like more and more women have been outside the home and dedicating more and more time to this idea of a career. And so legitimately just physical time with children and parents is at an all-time low. You're kind of not raised by your parents in some ways. A lot of times in our society, you're raised by TV and your public school or whatever. And that's a real problem. I also mentioned, I think an effect would be who's the leader syndrome. That's just what I'm calling it. So we underestimate this, but if there is this idea that male headship is wrong and it's not true, and it's just always been a psyop and it's just been men oppressing women, well then, if there is not a discernible head in the home, but it's just two equals that have no difference, that's going to be a confusing thing, I think, for both the man and the woman, as well as the children, right? Who's the leader? So I think about anything I've ever been a part of, like a sports team, or a job or anything like that. Even a church will typically have a main preaching pastor or a senior pastor, right? Even if it's even if it's a first among equals kind of a thing, right? Where there's equal, equal wisdom by the elders, equal, I guess you could say equal authority in a sense, but still one is typically seen as the leader. I think the same thing is true in a household. There can only really be one boss of a household. And ultimately, I get the idea is that it's God, of course, but I'm talking about, delegated authority. And if there's not a clear leader on a sports team, like a head coach or a boss at where you work or whatever, things delve into chaos pretty quick because there's no chain of command, right? For you to know what's right or what's wrong, or who delves out the consequences, or which direction we're going. How do I even know if I'm doing right or wrong? And that's a big thing in my estimation. So who's the leader syndrome, I think, is real when it comes to the effect of feminism, that genie that's been let out of the bottle. And now a lot of people get married. And I really think that people will get married these days and they do not ask the basic question, which sounds a little coarse, but I think it's important. Who's the boss? Who is the boss of this household? And before Jesus jukers get to me, I understand that ultimately Christ is king and Christ is head of his church and Christ is head of every family that lives on the face of the earth. But the delegated authority from Christ is given to the husband as head of his wife. But these days, I think maybe both sexes, particularly men, are afraid to ask that question because they're afraid of what their potential wife might answer. Well, we're both boss, or I'm the boss. Which is a reversal of God's created order, which will lead to some of these consequences we're talking about. And then it'll lead to the confusion. So couples don't talk about this, and then they enter into a relationship or much less marriage, and things go south pretty quick because they can't make the most basic of decisions because, well, they never established who's the decision maker primarily, who's the leader, who's the follower, right? And think about being a part of something like that where it's never been established. if I were a kid, it'd be a great way to play my parents off against each other. I'll tell you that much. But it's not a great way to run a household in good order and nurturing to the kids, right? Because they don't know who to look to for the ultimate direction. Who's the leader syndrome? I even put here, like success as almost a family is redefined. So I get the sense that in generations past, like success as a family meant, we provided and, we kept a roof over your heads. We also raised you to be virtuous. We also raised you um, to raise a family of your own. We also raised you with a general purpose that wasn't just get the best job that you can, right? But it feels like with feminism, because both men and women are far more career driven in that model, and the family is almost second. At best, I think it's, for women, like I balanced work and family decently well. Like that's at best. At worst, it's just you gave your life over to some job or career, but you neglected your children because you can't have it both ways, particularly as a woman who is designed physically to be with children. Um, at worst, it's like, oh, I truly messed up a lot of things in my family. Um, but if the reverse is true and you embrace God's design, you can hold your head high and say, I gave my family life and nurture. I brought life into my household. I supported my husband and his desire to raise up kids that would be productive and God honoring members of society. And I was instrumental in that process. I was the instrument that God created me to be rather than something that he just didn't create me to be. I'm a harp. I can't be a saxophone if I'm a harp, right? But I think success is redefined subtly under a feminist framework. It's like almost both men and women just become these two people that are here to kind of just get the best job that they can and make as much money as they can. And, they want to provide for their kids and give them some values, but there's not a direct pointed telos of why we're doing what we're doing. And then, next slide here, kind of one more effect of feminism broadly, a chasteness and a quiet spirit, those are a casualty. Are a casualty, right? So if women in general, their domain is now no longer primarily the household, which is meant to be, though it's not always, but it's meant to be a place of peace, right? The household is meant to be a place of peace and a place of respite, a place where you come after being beat up by the, terrible sin-filled world, so that you might enjoy, for example, the wife of your youth, be with your kids, those types of things. There's less time with the home being the domain, and industry is now a woman's domain. It's where the most time are spent, industry, rather than with kids, right? And we know that working in the business world or whatever, like that usually involves kind of it's a fight daily. It's constant conflict with other people. And I get that if you're a mother, there's conflict with your kids, of course. It's not like you're sheltered from the world. But in general, that's what industry really is. It's constantly fighting to maintain your standing. It's fighting to advance because you even need to, not even if you want to. And if that's the case, if that's your day to day for years, that gentle and quiet spirit, I believe, is going to be to some degree compromised, right? It's just a natural. You just get hardened a lot of times if you're working out, in the world for the most part, right? And so I think the quiet spirit's gone. And if the traditional ways of womanhood are seen as oppressive, I believe that, of course, the traditional purpose of sex, at least one of them being child rearing, would decline. Right? I'll say that again. If traditional ways of womanhood are seen as oppressive, I believe that therefore a traditional purpose of sex, which one of which primarily would be child rearing and raising, would decline. And we see that clearly. That for pockets of society where feminism has taken its most hold, I mean, they're definitely seen as a burden. Clearly, I mean, there's a reason that feminism and abortion rights go hand in hand. It's like they're best friends. That's not a accident or anything. So those are just some of probably the 10,000 billion effects of feminism that I could see as a society. And again, I'm not someone who wants to simplify things too much. Like, I don't want to say all the problems are in our society because of feminism. Well, no, it's not, right? Are men lazy and are men sexually degenerate because of feminism? I mean, there's maybe some truth to that, but that's not the only reason, right? Is our economy all jacked up completely because of feminism? It maybe has a part to play with it, but not always. I think it's important for us, and especially in this day and age of rabbit holes and algorithms, not to see one niche way of thinking that it has a lot of truth to it as the all-encompassing truth of the universe, right? And I think we can do that with feminism. Be like, oh, if we just fix feminism, it's like, well, we'd still have sin, and therefore we'd still have issues, right? And so it's not the reason for everything. It's not the reason for the bad of everything, right? That's the point. So, you know, again, last thing I'll say on this is, and I say this as nicely as possible, but I think a couple just has to come to grips with, you know, are we in agreement who is the boss? Ultimately, Christ. But are we in agreement of who is the leader of this house? Who has the authority? Some measure of authority, at least. We can agree or disagree on how much. And if the answer is it's a 50-50 tag team type thing, well, then that's not God's model. And honestly, if you really think about it, that's actually the woman has the authority, um, because she's setting the table of what's being said and done there. So I think that's worth thinking about. It's the question that I don't mean coarsely or anything like that, but who's the boss? It's a question worth actually asking, because I think a lot of couples these days, if they even have a direction with where they're going, which a lot of times they don't, it's just let's shack up. But even if they have somewhat of a direction, like a hope at getting married, that question is buried deep below a lot of things, I believe. But it just has to be crystal clear, defined, because those things are going to come out in time in things like philosophy of raising kids, belief about various secondary doctrines in Christianity, all these sorts of things, right? Schooling, education, right? So we need to have things sorted out on a foundational level. So there's tons more that can be said about generally feminism, but those are the two frameworks I think are helpful. One, bad solution to real problems, or bad solutions to fake problems. That's like first group. And then the second way of thinking is, feminism is one, a denial of God by denying his created order of household hierarchy. You can't say you're following God if you say I'm not following him in the way that he gave. You're talking out of both sides of your mouth. And number two, it's just an assault on femininity. It is a reversal and a reverse engineering of women, and it's sad to see. And over time, we've seen that happen. Um, you know, just the sexual degeneracy that's celebrated in women now, I never thought I would see. And I'm not defending it being celebrated in men. I think that's been going on way too long. So that being said, we'll go on to second wave feminism. So here's some stuff. I got a lot of stuff from a website called humanrightscareers.com. Thank you, Jeff Donaldson. Brother Jeff, thanks for being able to speak bold truths online. Amen, brother. Thanks for being here for a little while. Humanrightscareers.com. What's a basic definition of second wave feminism? So, second wave feminism built on the legacy of first wave to shift women's place in society through culture, legislation, and victories in court. While the feminists of the first wave had focused on the voting and property rights of a small group of women, second wave feminists fought to expand the definition of womanhood, ensure reproductive rights, increased financial independence, improve workplace equality, and address domestic violence. And so those are the main. So if you think about first wave, big picture of first wave, if you remember, nothing else, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, suffrage, women's voting being the main thing, and things like the temperance movement, like doing some sort of regulation, at least on intoxication and alcohol. And that movement generally ended, it's agreed, in about 1920 with the 19th Amendment. Women can vote. And then a lot of people say that second wave really started in the early 60s. And we might be thinking, well, what happened in 40 years? A lot of world history in the West happened in 40 years, right? Great Depression happens within less than a decade from when suffrage occurs. Then you get into World War II. And, by the time you get into the 50s, men are returning from war in the U.S. And I guess elsewhere, like the West, we're talking about primarily England and the U.S. And so really, I don't think, feminism had quite the luxury of advancing all that much in those times as much as it would later on and before that, just because, necessity is what's going to take the day. And so when you get to the 1960s, you've had a decade of stability in the 50s where things kind of settled back down a little bit. Men have returned to their jobs. Women have returned to the home. Families, have been started, baby boom. And then we get into the 60s through, I guess, late 80s. Some people maybe say in the 90s, I guess, but 60s through 80s, second wave feminism. So we'll talk about those elements of definition of womanhood, ensure reproductive rights, financial independence, workplace equality, and domestic issues. And again, sometimes feminism, a broken clock is right sometimes. So again, I'm not saying every last fruit of feminism has been wrong. I want domestic violence to be criminalized, regulated, however you want to say it, right? If it's actually violence, of course. So this is not be throwing out every last thing. That would be ridiculous. But I wanted to segment this into two categories. Second wave feminism, what was going on with it. I'll segment it into first category, cultural issues that kind of were the underpinning, and then, legal, we might say advances. I would say regressions in a lot of ways, I suppose, but culture. What were the cultural foundations of second wave feminism? The cultural foundations, you see in that orange, we're down to the orange section. They were there from the beginning of the first wave, as I mentioned with Katie Stanton. Again, it starts with household, that being a prison rather than a place of respite for allegedly the feminist. But it grew in prominence in the second wave, right? So first wave really got its major point of victory and this crazy moment in suffrage. But then we're getting more deeply into the psychology and culture of things, I think, in second wave. And so this starts with Simone Beauvoir, who wrote The Second Sex in 1949. I think she's French, so she wrote in French, and then that impacted the U.S. A few years later. I think it was in the I meant to say 59, I think, but in the early 60s is when that impacts the U.S. And here's some stuff about this book overall, kind of a Sparks Notes version. Actually, it is Spark Notes. Dubois, primary thesis in her book, The Second Sex, is that men fundamentally oppress women by characterizing them on every level as the other, defined exclusively in opposition to men. Man occupies the role of self or subject. Woman is the object, the other. He is essential, absolute, and transcendent. She is inessential, incomplete, and mutilated. He extends out into the world to impose his will on it, whereas woman is doomed to immanence or inwardness. He creates, acts, invents. She waits for him to save her. This distinction is the basis of all de Beauvoir's later arguments. And I'll go ahead and stop right there because I think it's worth mentioning that I sincerely believe, and I think any person who's in line with God's reality, specifically biblical Christians, should affirm the fact that Adam was created and woman was created, Eve in this case, was created for man, and man was not created for woman. We see that in 1 Corinthians. Man is head, woman is helpmate. The for, why was she created for men was not, like I said in another stream, it's not for some sick sexual pleasure fantasy, not some objective use, right? But specifically for the helping of honoring God in making his name known in the world, being fruitful, multiplying, filling the earth, and subduing it, basically ordering the earth and making the earth follow the Lord. That's our mission, is we're glorifying God in what we do, essentially. But the idea of man being made not for woman, woman for man, I'm sure that we can take that far too far, right? And we can basically act like women are just non-playable characters or something, to use the modern term with video games. But that's clearly not the case biblically when it comes to how much men were called to cherish their wives, to love their wives. We see the Proverbs 31 woman, she's described as strong in the proverb. She puts her hand to something, it succeeds. She's industrious, she's smart, all these things. So clearly that's not what the Bible teaches about, what this helpmate and being subject to a husband talks about, right? But there is some truth, if we're couching it correctly, in what Beauvoir is saying is terrible, right? I'm not saying that we should oppress women. all of these things. But I am saying that in general, uh, God created men to be the active agents in glorifying Him in the leading role. Because again, society works from households and makes its way out into the rest of the overall society. And so there's a sense in which, while we're not relegating women to being stupid or anything like that, there is a God's design element there, authority and hierarchy, and one leads, another follows, and when they're working together, it's beauty and it's music and it's amazing, right? But this is her view of the world. It's the overarching narrative. I talked about that last stream, but like basically one of the at least overarching narratives of history is that men oppress women over and over and over and over and over with no exception, right? And if you're not a feminist like me, you don't see that as the overarching narrative. You see that people abuse power, and so some men, and sometimes in large swaths, abuse power and abuse their authority, which has been delegated by God. However, hierarchy does not mean abuse. And I think for the feminist, a lot of times that's the case, right? From jump. And so I believe that de Beauvoir is bringing that psychology in, because she would see any hierarchy in a marriage, for example, as shackles, as slavery. So I would say that with her. She goes on. In her justifications, de Beauvoir studies some of the ways that women reinforce their own dependency. This is interesting. It's in yellow. Narcissists, women in love, and mystics all embrace their immanence by drowning selfhood in an external object, whether it be the mirror, a lover, or God. And that's fascinating to me. She says this: narcissists, that is, women in love and mystics, all embrace their immanence by drowning selfhood in an external object, whether it be the mirror, a lover, or God. And you and I are both, I think, intelligent to know that I am not you and you are not me. And yet our primary identity is actually not in ourself, but in God, right? Because we're made in His image. And yet we are still individuals. I am not whoever, Jeff, and Jeff is not Bill, and Bill is not Tammy or whoever. But I think it shows her view of God fairly clearly when she says that she compares, narcissists. I guess that would be drowning in the mirror. Women in love drown themselves in a lover, and mystics drown themselves in God. Well, we, of course, can be far too obsessed with someone that we love. It can become an idol, obviously. Of course, we can be too self-obsessed. But I don't think we can be too God-obsessed. We are called to love God with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength. But that, I think, shows her spirituality. And then I did want to skip down just a bit to that last section, yellow, because I think this really hits it. Right before it, at least. From the very beginning of her discussion, Beauvoir identifies the economic underpinnings of female subordination. Listen to this. And the economic roots of female women's, that is, liberation. Only in work can she achieve autonomy. Woman can support herself, or if a woman can support herself, she can also achieve a form of liberation. In the concluding chapters of the second sex, she discusses the logistical hurdles women facing in pursuing the goal. Right. And so I kind of wrote this on another page, but I think more and more when I think about, feminism seemingly coming of age after, or, on the heels of the Industrial Revolution, and, now we're in the digital age, it seems that it's right in line with a lot of just materialism. It's very economic driven, right? So women used to be people that felt deeply for their children, right? And felt deeply about making their home a warm place. And it seems like with feminism, they were reverse engineered to basically be all about advancing their name and advancing their career, and seeing liberation as getting outside of this terrible shackle known as the home under the authority of their terrible, awful, no good, dirty, rotten husband. And so for her, liberation is seen in financial independence, right? Because then you don't have to answer, I suppose, to anyone, right? Because you can make your own decisions, and that's ultimate freedom, I think, in the feminist framework, which is why I don't think it's inconsistent that feminism has gotten to the place where it is, where now essentially the modern, really the pop feminism we see today is basically being sexually degenerate is the greatest expression of your liberation that you could do as a woman. Not in God's eyes. In God's eyes, it's the exact opposite. Um, your virtue and your virginity, your chastity, all those things, or your dedication to your one husband if you're married, those are wonderful values, but not so in where feminism has gone to, right? But if you reject God's ordering of how He says a household should work, which includes sex, why would we not think that sex in and of itself would not go off the rails as well? It would actually be crazy if it didn't. It'd be really weird if modern feminism. Could you imagine a world where modern feminism was all about chastity and virtue and remaining quiet and respecting men? I can't imagine that. I guess it wouldn't be feminism anymore, right? we couldn't have it. Yeah, not NPCs. Haha. Yeah. So again, that speaks again. John said not NPCs. So Big John Bevins, that is. It's really important to remember that when we're attacking feminism, it's not an attack on women. It's actually a defense of real womanhood when we're arguing against feminism. And I think that's the point. We're arguing for real order in God's world and real womanhood and even real masculinity. So, this is not a rail against women as much as it is a rail against a terrible set of ideas that hurt women and, hurt men, because any sin, any rejection of God's way and His order will inevitably hurt people. And something this broad in our society and our culture is going to hurt pretty much everyone, right? I think about kids growing up, even if they grow up in two-parent households, which obviously is rare these days. Again, I'm not completely blaming feminism for that. I'm not that kind of narrow ideologue. I think it's kind of foolish to think that way. But even if someone grows up in a two-parent household, again, that confusion syndrome or who's the leader syndrome, that comes into play. I feel like kids can see that. I feel like kids can see when there's not a cohesive chain of command, and mommy respects daddy, and daddy loves mommy, and daddy ultimately is in charge, and he's directing us, right? And mom has her say, and they talk and everything, but ultimately daddy's the one who's guiding our family, right? So kids can see when that's not at place, and kids can see when there's tension, right? And so yeah, I feel for that kind of environment. So that was the Second Sex by Dubois, right? And so that was, I think, a bit more academic than this next one. So again, this is Dubois, made Time Magazine, huge feminist kind of icon, I guess. And then you've got Betty Friedman, who wrote the Feminine Mystique, which had far more pop kind of culture feminism impact from what I read. That's what I gather when I read about her, is that. And so here we have some about her, kind of that second point here, going on to the next page here. Yep, main part of the page. She wrote The Feminine Mystique in 1963. The Feminine Mystique was a landmark book by her, published in 1963, that described, in yellow here, the pervasive dissatisfaction among women in mainstream American society in the post-World War II period. She coined the term feminine mystique to describe the societal assumption, this is interesting, that women could find fulfillment through housework, marriage, sexual passivity, and child rearing alone. And this was back, I think she kind of like polled or like talked to a lot of housewives at the time, suburban women, and got their thoughts basically. Further, prevailing attitudes held that quote unquote truly feminine women had no desire for higher education, careers, or political voice. Rather, they found complete fulfillment in the domestic sphere. Friedman, however, noted that housewives were unsatisfied with their lives but had difficulty articulating their feelings. Friedman deemed that unhappiness and inability to live to the feminine mystique as the problem that has no shame. So I think the idea of the feminine mystique, like what's this mystique she's talking about? It's the 1950s kind of picture of femininity with the perfect June Cleaver housewife type that's just constantly happy, is completely content just being within the four walls of her home, wears pearl necklace while she vacuums, and then always says, father knows best. And all she does is cook, clean, and care for her kids, and has no thoughts or ambition outside of that ever in the history of ever. And she's saying that this is not cutting it. Women are miserable. That's what Friedman is saying. And she calls it a pervasive dissatisfaction. Again, I want to go back to something here that I said earlier. Bad solution to perhaps real problems, right? So could it be, or could it have been a real problem that women were least common denominator, to use a lack of a better term, far too much, that they were kind of NBC or NPC type characters that, nope, just kitchen and bedroom, kitchen and bedroom, kitchen and bedroom, that's it. It's possible. I'm sure that happened, right? And that doesn't follow the biblical model overall, right? Just seeing like, yeah, I mean, general solar system should be the caring for children, the support of the husband in his endeavors, those sorts of things. But clearly in scripture, we see the Proverbs 31 woman has more in her mind than just the kids, even though what she does is in support of the kids, right? Sees a field and buys it, works with her hands, arms get very strong, is known in, the general area and is praised by her husband and kids, right? She was not just June Cleaver, a robot, kind of a Stepford wife, right? I think that's what Friedman is talking about. But even if that's a real problem, bad solution to a real problem, because the solution of feminism is to reject male hierarchy, to reject hierarchy, males in the overall authoritative position in their home, and even in other places like the church. We talked about that in another stream. And so, yeah, even if she has a point, she's wrong, because the solution is throwing out God's baby, which is his patriarchal system of the way the world works, with the bathwater, and that's just no good. So that's Friedman, and it made a lot more of an impact, I think, in U.S. culture, right? And again, what would become law was undergirded by cultural feelings and movements and all these sorts of things. And so I thought it was important to talk about the cultural aspect of the second sex and then Friedman, because ultimately a lot of times that's what you think about. A lot of times is you understand, like, this is what I feel is happening in society from what I can gather. I don't know exactly what we need to do about it. I don't know what law we exactly need to encode, but this is wrong. Something is wrong, right? And that's I think what she was tapping into. And again, I don't know if I would agree with 1% or 2% of her conclusions. I think a lot of it is an assumption. If your assumption is that male hierarchy is bad inherently, which from first wave was, then everything is going to go bad, because you're going to see everything as oppression, even when it's just good order. And maybe another thought in all this is, who says that all the time the reason that we exist is to be happy? God didn't say that. We are made for his glory, and that will ultimately lead to our happiness, but that doesn't mean everything is always happy, joyful, and feels good. But that's the hedonistic, pursuit of pleasure society that we live in. Big John Bevan says, I remember a couple years ago, feminists claimed they would stop having sex with men. They date for voting conservatively. Yes, please do that. Great idea. John says, yes, just stay off the market. We're better for it. Yeah, I can certainly understand where you're coming from, brother. That's hilarious. I do kind of remember that, actually. But I'm guessing that has not happened. I don't think, I really don't think that the sexual ethic has become more pure. It's maybe become more digital, which is sad, but there's more and more acceptance of quote unquote sex work, whatever you want to call it, like in various forms right now, just on digital means. And so maybe it's not as many shacking up with someone, but it's still sexual morality nonetheless. And unless we get to a narrowly defined biblical sexual ethic, nothing will be good. We're just sinning in a slightly different way. You know what I mean? So here we get into, those were some of the cultural giants. Obviously I had to skip some things, but two very important drivers of getting feminism back into the fold after, the World War II. And then we get to some of the legal ramifications, still things that we deal with today. Number one would be the Equal Pay Act of 1963, huge statute mandating equal pay for equal work performed by men and women, designed to eliminate wage disparity based on sex. So it was an amendment of the Fair Labor Standards Act, which prohibits sex-based wage discrimination. The law applies to all forms of compensation, including salary, overtime pay, bonuses, benefits, ensuring pay decisions are based on the job's requirements, not the employee's gender. So, mandated equal pay for equal work performed by men and women. And then we get to employment access. Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, massive, huge legal turning point in the U.S. and it mostly was amazing, right? But prevented employers, which is again good on its face, prevented employers from discriminating against employees on the basis of race, religion, sex, or national origin. One thing I'll say, as not someone who's the greatest at understanding economic phenomenon, but I'll give maybe 2 cents on this one. I think when it comes to Equal Pay Act, of course, we want to have fair wages. But I often do wonder if that is a little bit oversimplified, even in that time. Because if it is true that, especially back then, back in the 60s, that probably most women who were of workforce age were going within probably 2 to 3 years. Let's say they're 21 or something, or probably even younger than that. If they're 19 or something and they're starting a job somewhere as a secretary or whatever it is, I don't even know where they'd be working. It's if they even have a sexual interest in a man, which again was far more relatable and normal back then, it'd be fairly obvious to a boss that she's probably going to have a kid within 2 years. I would think that's a fairly normal assumption, especially if she's a normal person and talks about what she wants out of life and what's going to happen. And so, again, I'm no economic expert, but if I ran a company and I knew that, okay, this segment of my workforce, so we've got all these 20-year-old girls who, I know that they have men in their lives. A large segment of them are going to have a kid and then maybe have a second kid. And even if they somehow return here, it's going to probably be in a lot more limited capacity. Why would I waste so many resources on their temporary 2 year, even great work, when I have someone here just starting who's their age, which will probably work here 10 years? And I know that it will be probably harder to keep someone 10 years, but the skill that they gain in 10 years will be quite a bit. And so I'm probably going to give a few more resources to someone that I know won't have to basically involuntarily exit because of a biological thing, aka having a child and being with that child. And so again, I'm no economic expert, but I would think that that also played into and plays into even today alleged pay disparities. Is like, look, it's not just equal work for equally doing the exact same job. It's about trajectory. It's about what's going to happen in 1 year, all these sorts of things. I think it's a little bit oversimplified just to say that if someone is doing the exact same thing, but they're getting paid less, if it's man or woman, that it's definitely sexism. It's like, well, maybe it's not. Maybe there are other things coming into play, right? That's all I'm saying there. And then we get into, so that's number one, is like pay is huge. Equal Pay Act of 1963. And then we get into reproduction. So here's a few facts that all come in about the same time, which I find fascinating. So number one, birth control pill, from what I could gather, was first approved by the FDA in 1960, US. Then a massive court ruling, Supreme Court Griswold versus Connecticut Supreme Court ruling of 65, prevented anyone from limiting a woman's access to contraception or other methods of birth control, including the pill, right? So 1960, the pill is made allowed or approved by the FDA. 65, huge legal precedent of you cannot limit access to any sort of birth control. As this is happening, sexual revolution catches fire, mid-60s to late 60s, peace, love, LSD, all that kind of thing. And then in 73, you get Roe v. Wade, massive abortion legislation by the Supreme Court. So within about 10 to 13 years, what happens is, people basically start having far more sex with probably far more different people, at least far more openly. And yet there are fewer and fewer seeing having babies and raising children as a value. There are more and more attempts to not have children, but there's more and more sex happening. And it kind of got me thinking again back to the materialism aspect that I talked about earlier with feminism, if we're talking about these three, particularly two main legal victories in second wave feminism, which was equal pay and basically Roe v. Wade as a fruit of the birth control stuff, right? Roe v. Wade, the legal precedent for Roe v. Wade was that Griswold versus Supreme Court. And the Griswold versus Supreme Court was you cannot prevent any sort of birth control. And abortion was kind of argued as being birth control, which it is. It tends to be murder, but it is birth control because you're keeping your baby who's alive from being born. But so few, it seems that all these things, like with the sexual revolution, emphasis on not having kids and making more money, again, it goes so much back to materialism that seemed to have come on the tail end of the industrial revolution and onward. No longer were we thinking about, I guess, the soul of our society, but we were just thinking about how I could get mine, how I could advance my career. And if those are the two biggest legal battles, quote unquote, reproductive rights and equal pay, you see where the value system is in our society and the values that we pushed on women. Is it any wonder why the sort of you go girl mentality, I don't need no man, I'm a strong independent woman, has taken hold? I don't think it's any question if you look at those two things, equal pay and reproductive, quote unquote, reproductive rights. Our value went from rearing children, raising children, loving the next generation to I'm going to get mine, basically. And it's had terrible consequences. And a couple of probably lesser ones. Credit and spending. That's on the next slide. Credit and spending. Credit cards weren't available to everyone when they were first launched. If a woman wanted a credit card, she needed a man to co-sign. It wouldn't be under her name either. If she was the one making all the payments, women were considered riskier for banks. In the U.S., the Equal Credit Opportunity Act in 1974 made this discrimination illegal, while the U.K. passed a similar law in 1975. So not too much comment on that one. And then we get domestic abuse / violence. Second wave feminism drew attention to domestic violence and its many forms by opening shelters and grape. I'll say grape with a G, crisis centers. In 1972, the emergency grape line opened in D.C. The next year, the term domestic violence was used for the first time at a UK Parliament address. Feminists also pushed for changes to the law. Before the 1970s, marital grape was legal in every part of the United States. Michigan and Delaware partially outlawed in 1974. By 1993, it was a crime nationwide. And I'm certainly not going to argue against those rulings. That's a wonderful thing. And if feminism had a hand in making that happen, well, thank the Lord that he used that. But yeah, when you look at second wave, it's an extension of the first and seems to be a lot more about the psychology of men and women, a lot more about moving into the realm of mere materialism versus seeing the household as a wonderful thing to make one's solar system around. And so, yeah, it's a depressing thing because what's often presented as the fruits of feminism or equal pay is that it's these massive legal victories, quote unquote reproductive rights, like I've said. But ultimately, what is happening there is it's the continued push for men and women being the exact same. And that's what equality is really talking about when we talk about it in our society. We're talking about that there's no real difference and there's no real design by God, and there are therefore no different roles. And it's no wonder to me that both men and women are so unhappy. Ultimately, with this arrangement, we can lie to ourselves, but ultimately, we see the poor nature of egalitarianism in our society, and it's been a very sad thing to see. So again, second wave gets into the psychology of feminism and basically into the fruits of embracing materialism, in my estimation, versus what we saw before, which was household and child rearing. And how does this affect the church? Again, this is, I suppose, with first wave too, but I think with second wave, um, because men and women, a lot of men and women for so many years have been brought up, if they're not brought up in strong, solidly biblically founded households, they're basically brought up to have this mentality of both sexes are equal in every single way, that there's no disparity, no difference. They're brought to think, I think, that hierarchy is inherently like oppressive. And so I think the way that it affects the church is some just are explicitly feminist, and that's sin. But I think it affects even more conservative churches in a more under the radar way. And that is that lack of basic cohesion between men and women that goes unspoken or even kind of unassumed. And I think that that causes probably a lot of marital problems that we don't give credit for. Because again, we go in with different ideas of what God's design is. We go in with different ideas of what success is. And that causes a lot of problems. And so that's where I think it's really hurt the church, is that any sort of hierarchy and design element and therefore role element is seen as some sort of uh, disparity and oppression, when in reality it's for the good of both parties, men and women. So all that being said, hope those who are watching this now enjoyed it. Hope those who watch it later enjoy it. That is all I have to say, and I will see you on the next stream. Thank you so much.